The morning light in downtown Birmingham was always harsh, bouncing off glass towers like cold fire, but inside Creswell Holdings it felt even colder. Every day at precisely 5:45 a.m., when most of the city still clung to sleep, Denise Carter slipped through the revolving doors in her pale gray uniform. She moved without sound, her sneakers worn thin, her posture upright but unassuming, her wiry curls pulled neatly into a bun at the nape of her neck. To the guards at the front desk, she was a familiar blur. To the executives who would later sweep in with tailored suits and glistening watches, she was already invisible before they had even arrived. Her cart rattled softly as she pushed it across the marble lobby, the smell of disinfectant trailing behind like an unseen perfume. She wiped fingerprints from the glass, straightened the magazines on the coffee table, and mopped away yesterday's footsteps before the new ones came. Nobody ever thanked her. Nobody ever asked her name. They called her Miss Denise, a title that sounded polite but carried the same indifference as saying, the janitor. Her last name was forgotten, her history erased. She was a shadow drifting from corridor to corridor, acknowledged only when someone spilled their coffee or needed the trash taken out faster. But Denise noticed everything. She noticed the way Bradley Cooper, a young marketing associate, always carried himself with too much swagger, talking louder whenever women passed. She noticed the secret glance that Meredith Chandler, the head of finance, exchanged with a certain board member when they thought no one was watching. She noticed who left the office late at night, whose hands trembled when signing documents, whose laughter sounded more like a shield than joy. 15 years of sweeping, wiping, polishing, and emptying bins had given her more knowledge of this empire than any executive report ever could. Still, no one wondered why she stayed. 15 years is a lifetime in the corporate world, yet Denise remained, her uniform fading, her sneakers thinning, her eyes sharper with every passing day. People whispered about her sometimes, usually with pity or scorn. She must not have had any better options. Imagine working here all your life and never once sitting behind a desk. Their words floated around her like smoke, but she never flinched. She absorbed them in silence, her face calm, her body steady, as though she had long made peace with the role they believed she belonged to. Yet there was a stillness in her gaze that unsettled those who lingered too long. She could be polishing the glass walls of the boardroom, her head slightly bent, and still catch every whispered remark about bonuses or layoffs. She could be mopping the marble floors of the executive wing while hearing confessions about deals that bent the law. And when she walked away, her silence carried weight, as if she was storing every word in some unseen vault. Occasionally, new interns fresh from college greeted her cheerfully in the mornings. "Good morning, Miss Denise," they'd say with bright, hopeful smiles. She always nodded politely, but never encouraged them further. She knew the pattern too well. Within months, even those kind greetings would fade. They would learn from their superiors that she was part of the furniture, not part of the family. Soon enough, they would glide past her without a glance, caught up in their world of deadlines and titles. What none of them realized was that Denise's silence was not weakness. It was choice. Behind her stoic face, behind those steady hands wringing out another mop or scrubbing away another stain, lived memories sharper than glass. She remembered board meetings no one thought she could hear. She remembered contracts being discussed in hushed tones in the late hours. She remembered the arrogance that had seeped into this building like poison, drop by drop, until it became the air everyone breathed. Every morning as she stood at the far end of the lobby, looking up at the tall glass elevators and the company logo etched in steel, she felt the same unspoken question pressing against her chest. Why was she still here? Why endure years of invisibility, years of being mocked, years of being treated like dust on the carpet? She never gave the answer away, not to the workers who pitied her, not to the executives who sneered at her. Her secret lived deep beneath her silence, waiting. Like a storm gathering quietly over the horizon, Denise Carter's presence was both unnoticed and unforgettable, hidden and unyielding. She swept through those hallways like a ghost, but her eyes, calm, sharp, unwavering, were not the eyes of someone who had been broken. They were the eyes of someone who remembered, someone who had not forgotten a single thing. And if the people at Creswell Holdings had ever paused long enough to truly look at her, they might have seen that her silence was not emptiness. It was a warning, a countdown to a day they never believed would come. Thomas Wexler arrived at Creswell Holdings each morning the same way he lived, loud, fast, and determined to make sure the entire building knew he was in charge. The polished black Mercedes would screech to a halt at the front entrance, and the valet boys would rush forward as though a head of state had arrived. He would step out in a tailored suit so crisp it looked ironed directly onto his body, his smile gleaming for anyone who might be watching. His expensive cologne filled the air like an announcement. The king has entered his castle. Inside the building, his shoes clicked across the marble floor like gunfire, quick and sharp. The receptionist sat a little straighter. The interns lowered their voices. Managers rehearsed their updates in their heads, terrified of stumbling under his glare. To them, Wexler was not just a CEO. He was the storm they had to survive each day. But to Denise Carter, standing quietly at the far end of the lobby with her mop bucket, he was simply another man who believed power made him untouchable. She watched him sweep through the revolving doors, his eyes darting briefly toward her as though she were a smudge on the wall. He never said her name, never offered a greeting. Instead, he gave her that half-smile executives give when they think they're being generous, an expression that wasn't kindness at all, but a reminder of her place. One Tuesday morning, he strolled past with a slice of cake balanced on a paper plate, leftover from a board member's birthday. Without hesitation, he let the frosting-laden piece tumble from the plate to the marble floor. It splattered across the very tiles Denise had polished an hour earlier. Wexler's eyes met hers for only a moment, smug and daring. "Miss Denise," he said, his voice thick with mockery, "you missed a spot." The employees who walked by tried not to react. A few smirked. Most pretended they hadn't heard. Denise bent down without a word, scooping up the mess, her expression steady, her hands precise. Wexler lingered just long enough to add, in a hushed but cutting tone, "I sometimes think you people only pretend to work. If I paid you extra, would you actually do a better job?" He chuckled at his own cruelty and walked away, leaving behind only the sour echo of his words. Moments like this defined him. Wexler thrived on being the sharpest voice in the room, the one no one dared challenge. He called junior managers into meetings only to belittle their reports, relishing the way they shrank in their chairs. He announced new cost-saving measures with the smooth confidence of a politician, never acknowledging that those cuts meant single mothers lost benefits or older workers were pushed into early retirement. Every corner of Creswell Holdings echoed with his arrogance. He kept his office door open, not because he was approachable, but because he wanted people to see him, leaning back in his leather chair, feet propped on the desk, phone pressed to his ear as he barked orders about multi-million-dollar contracts. He demanded admiration the way some men demanded air, and most people gave it to him, even if it came wrapped in fear. Yet in the silence between his footsteps and his boasts, there was Denise. Always nearby, always overlooked. She wiped the boardroom tables while he boasted about record profits that came from stolen wages. She emptied the trash cans in hallways where his allies laughed about layoffs. She mopped outside his office while he congratulated himself on squeezing another benefit out of the workers below. He thought she was invisible, but she was not. Each insult, each careless act of contempt, each time he dropped a mess for her to clean, it was stored, remembered, and written down in that black notebook hidden deep in her locker. She never looked at him with anger, never flinched at his cruelty, but her eyes followed him like a quiet ledger keeping track of debts. Wexler believed his empire was unshakable, that he alone commanded the story of Creswell Holdings. He believed the janitor who mopped his floors was powerless, voiceless, forgettable. What he never understood, what he would only realize too late, was that every empire can rot from the inside when the one person everyone ignores is the only one who truly sees it all. At night, when the last of the executives had slammed their office doors and the elevators fell silent, Creswell Holdings belonged to Denise Carter. The echo of her footsteps across the marble floors was the only sound in a tower that had, just hours earlier, buzzed with endless phone calls, meetings, and false laughter. She moved slowly, deliberately, with her mop in hand, but her eyes were wide awake, scanning every detail, listening for every whisper that lingered in the air. In the break room, she would pause just long enough to straighten the chairs, but her gaze always fell on the bulletin board filled with schedules, memos, and careless notes scribbled by management. Denise read everything: dates of sudden layoffs, restructuring notices, and scribbled reminders about cutting overtime. She never tore them down. She never commented. She simply committed them to memory, storing every injustice like threads she knew she would one day weave into something unbreakable. When she finished her shift, she returned to the basement locker room. There, tucked behind a stack of cleaning supplies and hidden in the back of her locker, sat a small black notebook. It was old, its corners bent, its pages worn from years of being turned by steady, calloused fingers. This was not just a notebook. It was her quiet rebellion, her private archive, her invisible weapon. Page after page was filled with neat, careful handwriting. Dates, times, names, direct quotes, evidence of conversations she had overheard when no one thought she was listening. A vice president joking about firing older workers to save on insurance. A finance manager bragging about forged invoices. Notes about drivers forced into double shifts without overtime pay. She had recorded it all, year after year, building a chronicle of Creswell's decay. Sometimes she added photographs, quick snapshots taken on her phone when no one was around, a ledger left open on a desk showing unexplained executive bonuses, a payroll sheet that mysteriously docked hours from the janitorial staff. She had even managed to slip a recorder into her cart on more than one occasion, capturing the arrogance of voices that believed walls kept their secrets safe. To anyone else, it would have looked like a pile of meaningless scraps, but to Denise, every line, every detail was a piece of a larger puzzle she had been assembling in silence for 15 years. The notebook had become her shield against despair. Each time someone mocked her, each time Thomas Wexler dropped another insult, she would return to that locker and write it down, reminding herself that none of it would be wasted, nothing would be forgotten. As she flipped through the pages late one night, she paused on a record from years earlier. Curtis Banning, Roland's old friend, now retired into an advisory role, had laughed in the boardroom about cutting out dead weight after Roland's death. Denise had written it down, her handwriting steady, even as her heart had broken. Looking at it now, she could still hear the echo of his laughter. Her chest tightened, but her grip on the pen steadied. This was not just about her anymore. This was about every person who had been trampled by the arrogance of Creswell Holdings. Denise closed the notebook and held it against her chest for a long moment. The hum of the air vents above filled the silence, steady and cold. She knew what no one else suspected. This empire was rotting from within, and she, the janitor they never saw, held the record of its corruption in her hands. She placed the notebook back into her locker, locking it carefully before slipping into the dark night. To the world outside, she was still invisible, just a tired woman, and in a faded gray uniform walking home. But to herself, she was something else entirely. She was the keeper of every secret, the quiet witness to every betrayal. No one at Creswell Holdings had ever asked why she stayed all these years. If they had, perhaps they would have seen the fire in her eyes, hidden beneath calm silence. Perhaps they would have noticed the way she carried herself, not as someone broken, but as someone waiting. Because Denise Carter wasn't just mopping floors, she was building a case. And one day, she would open that black notebook, and the ghosts of 15 years would come roaring back into the boardroom, demanding to be seen. Long before she became a shadow drifting through Creswell's hallways, Denise Carter had lived in a small brick house on the outskirts of Columbus, Georgia. The house was old, the paint peeling, the kitchen too narrow, but for Denise and her husband Roland, it was where the future began. The two of them would sit at their wobbly kitchen table late into the night, Roland's hands rough from long hours on the road, Denise's eyes sharp as she calculated figures on the backs of grocery receipts. The room smelled faintly of coffee and diesel, and their laughter filled every corner. Roland had been a dreamer, fiery, relentless, unafraid of the risks that came with hauling freight across Alabama and South Carolina. He knew every stretch of highway like it was written in his bones. Denise was the opposite. She was the careful one, the one who noticed the numbers that didn't add up, the contracts that hid dangerous clauses in fine print. Together, they were unstoppable, Roland's courage and Denise's caution balancing each other like two hands clasped tightly in the dark. It was Denise who had pushed them to file the paperwork properly, to create a separate legal entity instead of running contracts under Roland's uncle. One day, she told him, tapping her pen against the stack of forms, "This paper will save us from being swallowed whole." Roland had smiled, trusting her judgment more than he trusted the open road. When Denise's father passed away, he left her a modest inheritance. Many expected her to buy a small home, something safe and permanent. Instead, she slid the check across the kitchen table to Roland one night. Her voice was steady, though her hands trembled as she held her teacup. "This is everything I have. I'm trusting it to you, to us." Roland's eyes had filled with tears, his fingers closing around hers. It was the beginning of what would one day be Creswell Holdings. In the early years, they scraped by with outdated phones, a rusty fax machine, and Roland's endless miles on the road. But contracts grew, so did their reputation. Curtis Banning, Roland's childhood friend, joined as a partner, bringing connections and a loud laugh that filled their modest office. For a time, life felt unstoppable. But Denise never wanted the spotlight. She stayed in the background, filing documents, balancing the books, making sure every penny was accounted for. She didn't need her name on the office wall. Her reward was watching Roland's joy when another deal came through, his pride when he said, "We did it, D." Then the night came that shattered everything. A storm raged across the highways, sheets of rain blurring the world. Roland answered a call about a late shipment gone wrong. He left in a rush, promising he'd be back before dawn. He never returned. A collision, a tired driver, the phone call that ripped Denise's world in half. At the funeral, Denise sat quietly in the back, a black hat shielding her face. Curtis stood at the podium, speaking of Creswell's future, of its remarkable achievements, as though Roland had been a cog in a machine rather than a man who had poured his life into the business. Curtis never once said her name. He never once acknowledged that Denise had been part of it all. She felt herself vanish in that moment, erased like chalk washed from a Bose. Days later, her fears came true. Documents were redrafted, Roland's name stripped away, her access codes revoked. Curtis moved quickly, faster than her grief could keep up. Keys no longer fit, safes no longer opened. She had been written out of the very company she had built from the ground up. But Curtis had underestimated her. Denise had the originals, the founding agreements, notarized contracts, and the careful paper trail she had built with her own hands. She locked them away, knowing better than to fight immediately. The world would have seen only a grieving black widow against a powerful white partner. She knew she would lose, so she swallowed her fury and chose silence. And then she did something no one could have predicted. She applied for the night shift cleaning job at Creswell's headquarters under a different name with a forged address. They hired her instantly. After all, who questions the janitor? That's how she became Miss Denise, the woman nobody saw, the ghost in the gray uniform. While executives laughed and mocked, she carried the memory of her husband in her chest and the proof of her ownership hidden safely away. For 15 years, Denise Carter endured humiliation, invisibility, and cruelty. But each step she took with her mop, each whisper she overheard, each entry in her black notebook was not just survival, it was preparation. Because deep down, beneath the silence and the sorrow, Denise had never stopped being what she always was, the true co-founder of Creswell Holdings. And she was waiting for the day when the empire that erased her would have no choice but to remember. The boardroom on the 8th floor was a sanctuary of power, all polished walnut and gleaming glass, a place where decisions worth millions were made over catered lunches and careless laughter. For Denise Carter, it was just another room to clean. She entered with her mop and cart long before the executives arrived, wiping away dust from the vast table, polishing the armrests of the leather chairs, scrubbing the glass walls until they reflected the skyline outside. She always left the space spotless, knowing it would soon be filled with voices that barely acknowledged her existence. That afternoon, the room came alive with chatter before the clock even struck 3. Men in tailored suits and women in sharp heels shuffled papers, loosened ties, adjusted microphones. They talked quickly, confidently, like actors who had long rehearsed their lines. Denise moved quietly in the corner, crouching with her cloth to wipe a faint coffee ring from the table. She kept her head down, but her ears caught every word. Douglas Fairbanks, the executive vice president, entered in a rush, his cologne flooding the room before his laughter did. He spotted Denise and smirked, leaning toward his assistant, Amanda Hill. "Look at her," he said loudly enough for others to hear. "Imagine working in this building your whole life and never owning a desk, not even a chair. Can you believe that?" Amanda chuckled nervously, her eyes flicking to Denise as if to see whether the words had landed. "Guess she's used to standing, Douglas. Chairs are for people who matter, right?" The laughter that followed spread around the table like wildfire, bouncing off the glass walls until it felt like the entire room was mocking her. Some tried to hide their smiles, others openly snickered. Not one person spoke up. Denise's hands stilled on the cloth. She pressed her lips together, her eyes lowered, and continued, wiping as though she hadn't heard a thing. Her silence, as always, became their permission. The executives returned to their debates, how to slash benefits in the next quarter, how to restructure bonuses so the upper team got more while the drivers and janitors got less. Their cruelty was casual, almost bored, like trimming a hedge they didn't have to look at. Bradley Cooper, the young marketing associate in his navy suit, leaned back in his chair and spoke with smug certainty. "We can cut janitorial overtime again. Who's going to complain? What are they going to do? Write us a letter?" The room erupted in laughter again. Someone slapped the table. Someone else muttered, "They should be glad they even have jobs." Denise stood at the far end of the table, cloth in hand, her posture calm, her face unreadable. On the surface, she looked like a woman used to humiliation, shrinking further into invisibility. But inside, she was stone. She absorbed every word, every insult, every decision made by people who thought she was deaf. And when she left the boardroom, her steps were measured, deliberate, carrying the weight of everything she had just witnessed. That night, in the basement locker room, she opened her black notebook. She wrote it all down: the date, the time, the names, the cruel jokes, the proposed cuts, the exact words spoken. Each line of ink was steady, precise, as if carved into stone. When she finished, she closed the book and pressed her hand against its cover. Her chest ached, but her eyes burned with a quiet fire. 15 years she had endured this. 15 years of being invisible while the people she once helped lift into power mocked her like she was dirt beneath their shoes. Each insult was a crack in the facade, each decision a piece of rot spreading through the empire she had built with Roland. They thought she was powerless, just a janitor with a mop. But Denise Carter knew better. The cracks were widening, and soon the whole edifice would come crashing down. The rain was falling hard that Tuesday morning, streaking the tall glass windows of Creswell Holdings like tears no one dared to shed. Denise Carter pushed her cart through the hushed lobby, her sneakers squeaking faintly on the marble. It was supposed to be just another day, another round of scrubbing, polishing, and vanishing into the background. But fate has a way of slipping into the cracks of routine, and that day, it struck with a force that even Denise could not ignore. In the basement locker room, the fluorescent lights buzzed dimly overhead. Denise entered quietly, ready to store her jacket before heading upstairs. That's when she saw her, Cynthia Moore, one of the youngest janitors on staff, barely in her 20s, crumpled on the cold floor beside her locker. Her uniform was wrinkled, her hands trembling as she clutched a phone to her chest. Tears streamed down her cheeks, carving silent rivers across her skin. Denise approached slowly, kneeling beside her. "What's wrong, child?" she asked softly, her voice steady but touched with concern. Cynthia lifted her swollen eyes, gasping through sobs. "My son, he was in an accident. They've taken him to the hospital. I begged HR for the day off, but they said if I don't find someone to cover my shift, they'll cut my pay." Her voice cracked as she spoke, every word breaking against the weight of despair. Denise's chest tightened. She had seen this cruelty before, but hearing it spoken aloud from Cynthia's lips cut her deeper than she expected. Cynthia's hands shook violently as she whispered, "He's only 7. He's all I have, but they said policies are policies." For a moment, the locker room was silent except for Cynthia's muffled cries and the faint hum of the lights. Denise pressed a steady hand on her shoulder, her eyes dark and reflective. In that moment, she wasn't looking at Cynthia. She was looking at herself, years ago. A younger Denise, blindsided by tragedy, stripped of her place at Creswell, erased as though she never existed. She saw her own silent tears from Roland's funeral, her own shaking hands clutching the papers no one cared to read. She saw the way she had swallowed her grief and accepted invisibility because she thought she had no choice. Denise's jaw tightened. For 15 years, she had endured insults, mockery, and injustice. She had told herself patience was strength, that silence would one day deliver justice in its purest form. But seeing Cynthia, broken and powerless, shattered that illusion. Silence wasn't strength anymore. It was complicity. That night, Denise didn't head straight home after her shift. She sat alone in the break room long after the building had gone dark, the city lights outside blinking through the rain. Her black notebook lay open before her, its pages swollen with years of secrets and betrayals. She traced her fingers over the words she had written, each line a wound carved into Creswell's soul. Terrence Doyle, fired for asking about fairness. Bradley Cooper's sneers. Douglas Fairbanks' laughter. Wexler's cruel remarks. Cynthia's tears now joined the list, a name underlined with heavy strokes. Finally, Denise picked up her phone, her hands steady, her eyes blazing with resolve. She dialed the one number she had guarded all these years, Elliot Miles, her lawyer. The man who had once promised, "When you're ready, Denise, I'll be here." The phone rang twice before his calm voice answered. "Denise." She didn't hesitate. "Elliot, it's time." There was a long pause on the other end. He had waited years to hear those words, but when they came, they sounded heavier, more final than either of them had imagined. "Are you sure?" he asked gently. "Once this begins, there's no turning back." Denise closed her notebook and looked out at the storm drenching the city. Her reflection stared back at her in the window, no longer a ghost, no longer invisible, but a woman forged by years of silence, now ready to set fire to the rot that had buried her. "I'm sure," she whispered. "I've cleaned their mess long enough. Now it's time to clean them out." The call ended, but the echo of her words lingered. Outside, the storm raged, but inside, Denise Carter had become the storm. For 15 years, she had been a shadow. From that night forward, she would be something else entirely. Justice in flesh and blood, walking toward a reckoning no one at Creswell Holdings could escape. The nights grew longer, heavier, almost electric with the weight of what Denise Carter had finally set in motion. For 15 years, she had carried the burden of silence, but now every step she took, every page she turned, carried purpose. In the basement locker room, she sat at the metal table with her black notebook spread open and a small box beside it. The box was filled with USB drives, folded contracts, photocopied payroll sheets, and snapshots of documents executives thought were hidden forever. Each item was a fragment of truth, and together they formed a weapon more devastating than any sword. Elliot Miles, her lawyer, met her at a small diner on the edge of town, the kind of place where truckers came for strong coffee and no one asked questions. He arrived in his usual gray suit, tie loosened, briefcase clutched tightly in his hand. Denise slid into the booth across from him, her hand steady as she ushed the box across the table. He opened it, and his face tightened with awe and gravity. "My God, Denise," he murmured, sifting through the documents. "You've been building this for over a decade." Her expression didn't waver. "Every insult, every theft, every life they crushed. I wrote it all down. I collected everything they thought I was too invisible to notice." Elliot's eyes moved from the papers back to her face. "This is enough to gut them. Enough to bury Wexler and everyone who stood beside him. But you need to understand, the moment we put this forward, they will come at you with everything they have. They'll call you a liar, a thief, a bitter woman trying to rewrite history." Denise folded her hands calmly. "Let them. They can't erase the truth." From that night onward, Denise worked with Elliot in complete secrecy. During the day, she was Miss Denise, the janitor with the mop, silent and invisible. At night, she became something else. In Elliot's office, they spread the evidence across the long oak table like a map of war. There were the original partnership contracts signed by Roland Carter, Curtis Banning, and Denise herself, documents notarized and time-stamped, undeniable proof that she had always been a co-founder. There were financial ledgers showing how Wexler funneled funds into his own bonuses while cutting health insurance for workers. There were recordings of executives mocking employees, laughing about dead weight, and cutting the old ones loose. Each piece of evidence was logged, copied, and sealed in folders. Elliot insisted on backups, one set in his office safe, one with Denise, and one hidden in a bank deposit box under her name. "Paper can vanish, files can be shredded," Elliot said, sliding a USB drive into an envelope. "But 3 sets of truth, they can't destroy all of them." Denise listened, her face composed, but her eyes burning with memory. Every name she wrote down over the years came back to her. The workers fired unjustly, the families torn apart, the janitors who cried in silence. Each folder was not just evidence, it was a voice. But the most important preparation wasn't the documents, it was the timing. Elliot walked her through every legal step, the bylaws that gave a majority shareholder the right to call an emergency meeting, the procedure for a no-confidence vote, the requirement for documented proof. Denise memorized each one like scripture. At night, back in her small apartment, she rehearsed what she would say when the time came. Not words of rage, not words of vengeance, but words of truth, the kind that could not be ignored. Sometimes she practiced in front of the mirror, her reflection staring back at her in silence. She was no longer just a janitor, no longer the ghost in gray. She was Denise Carter, and the storm in her chest had become a vow. Meanwhile, inside Creswell Holdings, the rot continued unchecked. Wexler grew bolder, slashing overtime pay with the stroke of a pen, humiliating staff in meetings, strutting through hallways as though he owned the world. The executives whispered in corners, plotting new ways to bleed the company dry. They had no idea the walls were closing in, no idea that the woman pushing the mop bucket was the one who had dragged them into the light. Denise's silence had once been their shield. Now it was her sword. And as she locked her black notebook away one final time, sliding the key into her pocket, she whispered to herself, "It's almost over." The countdown had begun. The morning she chose to reveal herself felt different from the start. The air was sharp and clear, the kind that seemed to strip away every shadow. Denise Carter stood in her small apartment staring at the uniform folded neatly on her bed. For 15 years, that gray fabric had been her disguise. It had made her invisible, reduced her to Miss Denise, the woman who cleaned what others left behind. Today she would not put it on. Instead, she buttoned a crisp white blouse, slipped into a navy blazer that fit her shoulders like armor, and stepped into polished shoes that gleamed with quiet defiance. Her wiry curls, usually tied back in a practical bun, were styled neatly, framing her face with a dignity that had always been there but never seen. She looked at herself in the mirror, and for the first time in years, she saw not a janitor, but the woman who had once sat beside her husband at the kitchen table, building Creswell from nothing. The co-founder, the owner, the forgotten half of a legacy stolen from her. Her reflection did not tremble. It held her gaze steadily as though to say, "This is who you were always meant to be." When she entered Creswell Holdings that morning, the lobby seemed to freeze. The security guards who had long waved her through without a glance paused, blinking in confusion. The receptionist, Tasha, stared as though she'd seen a ghost, her mouth half open. For years, Denise had pushed a mop through that very entrance, head down, ignored. Now she walked with calm confidence, her heels clicking against the marble like a drumbeat of change. Whispers followed her almost immediately. Employees glanced up from their phones and laptops, whispering, "Is that Miss Denise?" Some squinted, unsure if they were even seeing the same woman. Others nudged each other, stunned by the transformation. But Denise didn't stop. She moved straight to the elevator, her back straight, her eyes unwavering. The executives stepping out barely recognized her. One or two gave polite nods, thinking she must be some outside consultant. None realized the truth, that the woman they dismissed for 15 years was walking toward the very room where their world would collapse. Upstairs, Thomas Wexler was in his element. He stood at the head of the boardroom table, gesturing at a projection screen, boasting about record profits and cost optimization strategies. His voice was smooth, arrogant, dripping with false pride. Around him, the board members nodded, though some looked weary, their eyes betraying unease. They had heard whispers about irregularities, about discontent brewing among the workers. Still, none dared to challenge him. At that very moment, Denise stepped off the elevator, flanked by Elliot Miles. He carried a sleek black briefcase filled with every piece of evidence they had assembled. Denise didn't rush. Every step she took down the hallway felt deliberate, as though she were walking through time itself, carrying the weight of 15 years of silence and suffering. Inside, the boardroom laughter swelled at some cruel joke Wexler had cracked. Just outside, Denise's hand brushed the door handle. Her chest rose and fell, steady, calm. She thought of Roland's smile, of Cynthia's tears, of every name in her black notebook. She thought of all the nights she had walked these halls unseen, and she knew this was no longer just her fight. She turned to Elliot briefly, and he gave a single, firm nod. Denise Carter pushed the door open. The chatter inside faltered, heads turned. For a moment, silence hung heavy in the air, the kind of silence that falls when a ghost walks into a room. Wexler's brow furrowed. He blinked, confused, then smirked as recognition slowly dawned. "Well," he drawled, his voice dripping with condescension, "if it isn't Miss Denise, what's the cleaning crew doing here in the middle of a board meeting?" Denise didn't flinch. She stepped fully into the room, her blazer catching the light, her presence commanding in a way none of them had ever imagined. She set her hand calmly on the back of a leather chair, her eyes sweeping the table one by one. The storm had arrived. The boardroom air was thick with confidence a moment before she entered, but the second Denise Carter stepped inside, everything shifted. The leather chair's sheer reeked as executives turned their heads, their conversations falling into a stunned hush. No one knew what to make of the woman standing before them, navy blazer, calm poise, eyes sharp as steel. To most of them, she looked vaguely familiar. To a few, recognition dawned slowly, disbelief pulling their brows together. It was Wexler who broke the silence first. He leaned back in his chair, lips curling into that smug half-smile that always preceded cruelty. "Excuse me," he said with a patronizing chuckle. "This is a board meeting. The janitorial crew handles the mess after business hours." He tilted his head, mock concern in his voice. "Unless you're here to mop up my coffee." A few board members laughed weakly, uncertain. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing something wasn't right. But Denise didn't blink. She moved with measured calm to the head of the table, and for the first time in 15 years, she wasn't holding a mop. She was holding her silence like a blade. Elliot Miles followed behind her, his black briefcase clicking open as he set it down with deliberate weight on the polished table. He spoke with a voice that cut clean through the unease. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am Elliot Miles, legal counsel for Miss Denise Carter, co-founder and current majority shareholder of Creswell Holdings." The words dropped into the room like thunder. The executives blinked in confusion. Curtis Banning, sitting near the end of the table with his hair now more salt than pepper, looked up sharply. His face drained of color, his lips parting, but no words came out. Wexler's smirk faltered, his voice tightening. "Co-founder? Shareholder? That's absurd. She's the cleaning lady. Denise stepped forward then, her gaze sweeping the length of the table. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, quiet, but it carried a weight no one could ignore. For 15 years, you've all looked right through me. You laughed in front of me, you schemed in front of me, you treated me as if I were invisible. But I saw everything, I heard everything, and I remember everything. She nodded to Elliot, who began distributing folders down the table. Thick stacks of documents slid across the glossy surface. Contracts, ledgers, payroll records, audio transcripts. Each folder, heavy with evidence, landed before stunned board members who flipped pages with trembling hands. This, Elliot said firmly, is the founding agreement from 1998, signed by Roland Carter, Curtis Banning, and Miss Denise Carter. This document, notarized and never rescinded, affirms her as co-founder. This, he continued, opening another folder, is the legal share transfer following Mr. Roland Carter's death, assigning full voting rights to Miss Carter, representing 52% control of Creswell Holdings. The boardroom erupted in murmurs. Some leaned forward, eyes scanning the signatures. Others looked at Curtis, whose face now sagged with shame. Wexler slammed his palm against the table. Forgery, lies. You think you can just waltz in here with a stack of dusty papers and... Enough! Denise's voice cut across his like a blade through glass. She met his eyes with unflinching calm. You think I'm here with nothing? 15 years, Thomas. 15 years. I have worked in these halls, listening while you mocked, while you stole, while you cut down good people as if their lives meant nothing, and I wrote it all down. Elliot pressed a button, and from his laptop a recording filled the air, Wexler's voice dripping with disdain. You know, sometimes I think these janitors just pretend to work. If I paid them extra, maybe they'd finally do their jobs. The sound of his own cruelty echoed through the room. Board members shifted uncomfortably, some exchanging glances that spoke of disgust. Wexler's face flushed crimson. You can't... This is out of context. Elliot ignored him, sliding more files across the table. Here are the falsified invoices approved under your authority. Here are the payroll adjustments cutting overtime without cause. Here are the records of your self-awarded bonuses while laying off long-standing employees. Every document cross-checked, time-stamped, and verified. The silence that followed was suffocating. Even those who had laughed at Denise over the years now stared at her with wide eyes, realizing the magnitude of what was unfolding. She wasn't the janitor anymore. She was the storm they never saw coming. Denise placed her hands flat on the table, leaning forward slightly. Her eyes swept the room one last time. I am not here to argue. I am here to remind you that I built this place, and I will not watch it rot any longer. The room seemed to tilt under the weight of her words. For the first time, the board members who had treated her as invisible now looked at her with something they had never shown before: fear. The silence in the boardroom stretched, taut as a wire. Thomas Wexler gripped the arms of his chair, his face flushed, his jaw tight with fury. For years, he had strutted through Creswell's halls like a king, untouchable and adored. Now, in an instant, the power he'd built on arrogance and cruelty was slipping through his fingers. You think you can humiliate me like this? Wexler spat, rising to his feet. His voice shook, not from weakness, but from the panic of a man watching his kingdom crumble. This company runs because of me, my vision, my decisions. Without me, Creswell collapses. Denise Carter did not move. She stood calm, composed, her eyes steady as stone. Elliot Miles remained seated, his voice sharp and cold. Mr. Wexler, under the Creswell bylaws, a majority shareholder has full authority to convene this meeting. Miss Carter holds 52% of Creswell's shares. You are no longer in command here. The words hit like a hammer. Murmurs erupted down the table as board members flipped through the documents, eyes widening as they read signatures, dates, and figures. Each page was a nail in the coffin of Wexler's reign. Wexler slammed his fist against the table. These people! He gestured wildly at the others. They know what I've done for this company. They've seen the numbers. They'll stand with me. But when his gaze darted around the room, all he saw were lowered eyes. Not a single ally rose to defend him. Jonas Evers, one of the youngest board members, cleared his throat nervously. The numbers, the evidence, it's all here, Thomas. We can't deny what's in front of us. The color drained from Wexler's face. For the first time, his voice faltered. You're really siding with her? With the janitor? Denise stepped forward, her hands resting lightly on the back of a chair. That's what you never understood, Thomas, she said, her voice low but carrying across the room. You thought this company was built on power suits and corner offices, But Creswell was built by people like me, the ones you never see, the ones you mock, the ones you believe are too small to matter, and now those same people are the reason you're finished. Security entered quietly, summoned by Elliot before the meeting began. Their presence sealed Wexler's fate. One officer approached him calmly. "Mr. Wexler, you'll need to leave the premises. Effective immediately, your position as CEO is terminated." Wexler's face twisted in rage. "This is fraud. You'll all regret this. Creswell is mine." His words broke as the officers took a firm step closer. He looked around desperately, but no one met his gaze. Even Curtis Banning, the man who had once stolen Denise's share of the company, sat hunched in his chair, his head bowed in shame. The fight drained from Wexler's body. He straightened his tie with trembling fingers, grabbed his briefcase, and walked out. The sound of his shoes clicking down the hallway echoed like the toll of a bell. The end of his empire. The end of his tyranny. When the door shut behind him, all eyes turned to Denise. She stood taller than she ever had in that building, not because of the blazer she wore, but because of the unshakable weight of truth she carried. Curtis finally lifted his head, his voice brittle. "Denise, I never meant for it to come to this. After Roland died, I thought..." His words collapsed, his excuse crumbling before it left his lips. Denise's gaze cut to him, steady and unwavering. "You thought I would disappear, that my silence meant surrender. But silence is not the same as defeat. You betrayed Roland, you betrayed me, and you betrayed every worker in this company by standing aside while men like Wexler turned Creswell into a pit of greed." Curtis lowered his eyes again, shame etched across his features. For the first time in years, he looked small, diminished by the weight of the truth he had tried so hard to bury. Denise turned back to the board, her voice resolute. "The era of exploitation is over. Today marks the end of arrogance and the beginning of justice. Creswell Holdings will no longer belong to those who trample others to climb higher. It will belong to those who build it every single day." The boardroom, once filled with laughter at her expense, now sat in reverent silence. The janitor they had ignored for 15 years stood at the head of the table as the rightful owner of it all. The fall of Thomas Wexler was complete. But Denise knew this was only the first step. The real work, the rebuilding, the healing, the justice, was only just beginning. The news of Thomas Wexler's downfall traveled through Creswell Holdings like a shockwave. By the next morning, the whole building buzzed with hushed conversations, glances traded in hallways, and messages whispered between cubicles. Workers who had long lowered their eyes when executives walked past now looked around with curiosity, disbelief, and a flicker of something more dangerous: hope. Denise Carter stepped into the lobby, not in her gray uniform, but in her blazer once again. This time there was no mop bucket to push, no rag in her hand. The silence that usually wrapped around her like chains had been broken. Now footsteps paused when she walked by. People stared, wide-eyed, whispering, "That's Miss Denise." "No, that's Miss Carter. She owns the company." But Denise did not rush to claim the plush CEO's office or sit behind the heavy walnut desk. She did something no one in Creswell's history had ever dared. She called every employee, drivers, janitors, warehouse staff, clerks, assistants, everyone, into the main auditorium for a company-wide meeting. The room filled shoulder to shoulder, voices buzzing with confusion. Some expected another lecture on efficiency, others feared a mass layoff. But when Denise walked onto the stage, there was no arrogance, no smug smile, no distance. She stood at the center with her hands clasped, her gaze soft but unwavering. "I want to begin with 2 words," she said, her voice steady and clear without a microphone. "Thank you." The room hushed instantly. "For 15 years, she continued, I watched all of you keep Creswell alive while others at the top fed themselves on your sacrifice. You kept the lights on, you drove the trucks, you swept the floors, you answered phones and stayed late, and for that, you were ignored. Worse, you were mocked. That ends today." A ripple of disbelief moved through the crowd. Alonzo Green, a veteran driver with weary eyes, raised his hand cautiously. "So, what does this mean for us? For the people down here?" Denise met his gaze, her voice firm. "It means fairness. It means no more stolen overtime. It means health insurance that you choose, not what's forced on you. It means every termination over the last 3 years will be reviewed, and if you were wrongfully dismissed, you'll be compensated or reinstated." Gasps filled the room. A few people clapped hesitantly. Others exchanged stunned looks, unsure if they could believe what they were hearing. From the front row, Deborah Williams, an HR associate whose conscience had long been bruised by orders she was forced to enforce, rose to her feet. Her voice trembled. "Does this mean we'll have a say? In policies? In decisions that affect us?" "Yes," Denise said simply. "From now on, no decision about your rights will be made without your voices. This company belongs to all of us, not just those at the top." The room erupted in murmurs. Some clapped openly now. A few shouted, "Amen." Others covered their mouths in shock. The hope was fragile, but it was real. Denise left the stage not to applause, but to something deeper, a silence heavy with possibility, with the sound of walls beginning to crack. Of course, not everyone was pleased. In the days that followed, the old guard, the ones who had thrived under Wexler's reign, muttered behind closed doors. Brent Wallace from finance sneered in a department meeting, saying Denise's experience was balancing petty invoices, not multi-million-dollar budgets. Others rolled their eyes when she spoke of open forums, whispering that the company would collapse under too much democracy. Denise never raised her voice. She let the numbers speak. When she ordered an independent audit, the truth spilled out like poison from a cracked pipe. Hidden contracts, padded bonuses, ghost invoices. By the time the first report hit the boardroom table, even the doubters had nothing left to say. But Denise knew paperwork alone would not rebuild Creswell. She walked the floors, visited the warehouses, ate lunch in the cafeteria with the staff. She listened to their stories, their frustrations, their hopes. She shook hands with drivers, hugged janitors, and asked secretaries about their children. She didn't just lead from the top, she lived among the people. And slowly, the invisible walls began to fall. The cafeteria, once divided by a management-only section, reopened to everyone. Employee appreciation events returned. Forums were held monthly, where even the quietest workers were invited to speak without fear. The change was not instant, the resistance was real, but in the hallways where whispers of bitterness once lingered, new words began to surface: respect, fairness, hope. For the first time in years, Creswell Holdings felt alive, and at the center of it all stood Denise Carter, the woman they had once dismissed as Miss Denise, now laying the foundation for something greater than profit. So, me thing, human. The sun dipped low over Birmingham, painting the glass tower of Creswell Holdings in shades of fire and gold. For the first time in years, the building felt alive. Laughter spilled from the cafeteria, children of employees ran through the courtyard during a family day event, and workers who once trudged silently through shifts now walked with a quiet pride. What had once been a fortress of arrogance had begun to breathe again. Denise Carter stood at the edge of it all, watching. She wasn't in her blazer today. She wore a simple dress, her curls left loose around her face. She blended in not as a ghost, but as part of the living heartbeat of the company she had fought so long to reclaim. People who used to avert their eyes now approached her eagerly. Drivers shook her hand, janitors embraced her, office staff smiled with gratitude. To them, she wasn't just the CEO. She was the proof that dignity could rise from the shadows. In the auditorium, a gathering had been arranged, not by Denise, but by the workers themselves. Long folding tables stretched across the room, covered with simple food, soda cans clinking, and paper plates stacked high. The air was warm with music and the hum of voices. Alonzo Green, the veteran driver whose back had carried Creswell's burdens for decades, stood and raised a soda can high. His voice rang with emotion. "To all the silent ones," he said, his throat thick. "To those who were treated as invisible, to those who were told they didn't matter. Today we raise our glasses to them, and to the woman who proved they were the foundation of it all." The room erupted in applause. People stood, raising their cans, their cups, their voices. "To Denise!" Tears pricked Denise's eyes, though she didn't let them fall. She lifted her glass quietly, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Never judge a person by their uniform. The janitor out pass in the hallway may be the one who built the house you're standing in. Treat every soul with respect, because justice and kindness begin with the simplest acts." The room went quiet for a moment, as though every heart paused to hold on to her words. Then the applause swelled again, thunderous and alive. Some clapped until their palms stung. Others whistled, shouted, or simply stood with tears in their eyes. Curtis Banning was there too, sitting quietly in the back. He hadn't been forced out entirely. Denise believed in accountability, not just revenge. He had lost his power, his influence, his ability to manipulate. What remained was an old man forced to confront the shadow of his betrayal every time he saw her. When her eyes met his across the room, there was no gloating, no cruelty, only truth. only justice. Later that evening, as the gathering dwindled, Cynthia Moore approached Denise with her young son in tow. His small hand clutched his mother's tightly, his wide eyes looking up at the woman who had given his mother hope. "Thank you," Cynthia whispered, her voice breaking. "You saved us." Denise knelt down, looking the boy in the eye. "No," she said softly, "your mother's strength saved you. I just made sure the world finally saw it." As they walked away, Denise lingered in the quiet. She thought of Roland, of his laughter at their old kitchen table, of the dreams they had written on scraps of paper. She thought of all the nights she had walked Creswell's halls unseen, her notebook heavy with secrets, and she thought of how silence, once her prison, had become her weapon. Above her, the tower glowed in the fading light. It no longer looked like a monument to greed. It looked like a house rebuilt, not just of steel and glass, but of people, dignity, and truth. Denise Carter smiled faintly, a woman no longer invisible. She had reclaimed not just her company, but her name, her worth, her place in history. And though the world would tell her story as one of revenge, she knew it was something deeper. It was the story of Stice finally being seen. And as the night settled, one truth echoed louder than the applause, louder than the laughter, louder than the years of silence. Denise Carter, once dismissed as Miss Denise the janitor, had risen not to power but to purpose, and her legacy would outlive every shadow that had once tried to erase her.